At this time, he was asked from Venice, from La Fenice, to compose Tancredi based on a story by Voltaire. And so this was his first large-scale opera, and it proved out to be a huge success. The young Rossini was considered to be one of the greatest composers of opera of his time through this piece. And of course, this success opened the road to the great operas that were about to follow. However, still Tancredi is a very special opera within the output of Rossini, because it's lying between two worlds, the old and the new. So it's a very classical opera, but it looks very much forward to the future. You can sense the new romantic ideal emerging from the language of a classical opera. And what is really interesting is that for the premiere of the opera, Rossini created the happy end, in contrast to Voltaire's story, where Tancredi dies in the end. But the tradition of opera seria was actually demanding that there was a happy end. And that's what he did. And that's what the public loved at this time. A little bit later, for a revival in Ferrara, Rossini changed this ending and composed a new ending, which ends in a dramatic way with the death of Tancredi, following Voltaire's original, which we usually play today. And we consider it as, of course, a masterful touch of Rossini to the romantic opera. Of course, at this time, it was not very usual that an opera ends with a death on the stage. And what is really interesting is that this was not successful at the time of Rossini. And when he presented the version of Ferrara, the audience was not particularly pleased with the sad ending and with the dramatic ending, so to speak, because they were used to a happy ending and they wanted to feel uplifted and to feel happy after watching a long opera seria. So Rossini didn't really continue with this choice of a dramatic ending, and for the future revivals, he turned back to his original happy ending. But of course, today things are different, and we are very accustomed to the drama and the sadness of the 19th century romanticism. So I think that in all glory, Rossini's original Ferrara ending is coming back. And I think it's mostly performed in most productions that I know, at least, that it's done with this ending. This is a super interesting score because it lies between classical tradition of the opera seria, and the romantic ideal, which is going to arrive with Belcanto singing and drama on stage. What is very interesting is that Rossini writes everything in such a detail, but it's not so easy to decode it. You need an experience in Rossini's music, an experience in aesthetics of the time, to know what is written and what is implied, and how certain symbols could be interpreted, not through the eyes of the later 19th century semiology, but rather in a very special Rossinian language. And I find personally that if all this is taken into consideration, the orchestration is really magical and ingenious. And of course, Rossini was a great orchestrator, but already at this early age, even before he composed the great masterpieces that we're about to follow, you can already sense the genius of such a theater-oriented composer, but also with such a great feeling for orchestration and for tone and for sound of the orchestra. There are many highlights in Tancredi, musical highlights, and of course, most of the musical highlights involve singing, because opera is singing. But I have to mention the famous Ouvertüre that is coming from a previous opera of Rossini, La Pietra di Paragone. It's an one-act farce that then he borrowed and he inserted it in Tancredi, hoping that he will give a second chance of life to this beautiful piece of music. So it's an orchestral showpiece that is very demanding for the orchestra, and it's like a pyrotechnic in the beginning of this beautiful opera, and it's very interesting that motifs of this overture are used inside the opera. in a concealed way probably, so that the audience doesn't really realize, but it's still there. So he used the thematic material of the Ouvertüre to highlight certain dramatic moments of the work. And the other moment that I think is unique is the dramatic ending, the version of Ferrara, one of the most beautiful and most divine death scenes in the history of opera, in my opinion. It's so simple, but it's real genius, and the opera fades away as if it evaporates in the air. I think it's really amazing, and I think that the audience would be really moved from this Ferrara ending.